Wait. It's like kind of constant.
Is that what I ended up doing? Yeah, it is.
Dawn,
What?
this morning, I got it stuck to you.
It looks really good.
And what prompted that?
It's, I've been wanting for a really long time.
Can I see yours?
Fine, yeah, like I said, and then. It's one that.
Where did you go to get it?
It's good. You got a little.
Yeah, it's like tattoos from her, and then we have some other stuff.
And it's a bug,
Yeah, it's a box elder book.
box elder bug.
Yeah,
Why that? Why that?
I like them, I think they're cool, and also like there's a lot on campus here as well as like in my house.
Oh.
It's like,
There you go. Cool.
yeah.
And what'd you get?
I got my hemlock cone touched up. It faded out, and so it looked like I just had like hot flower on my ankle.
Well, a hummingbird would have been cool.
Oh, one thing really quick. This artist did a hummingbird skeleton.
Yeah, on her Instagram, she has a bunch of like maps.
This is very important.
Oh, that's so sad. Why would you want that?
Is it correct?
Looks like a sad skeleton.
I started working on the hummingbird books.
Yeah.
That smells really good. It's so good. And it's some of Kendra's deer.
That it tastes good.
All righty. How are we all doing today?
It's sunny. It's sunny.
And it's gonna be sunny Saturday, right?
Yes. Is this supposed to be sunny at the beach?
I don't know. You know,
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We're gonna see puffins. We're gonna see puffins. We're gonna see all the rare birds.
anyway, and Kendra's not gonna go, so that will free up a little space, which means you guys won't be quite so squished. So that's cool.
Is Mitch coming with us?
Oh, yeah.
Is he gonna drive with us or something?
Yeah, he'll drive with us. He'll meet us up in Grand Ronde. He'll park his truck there and then he'll hop in and we'll all travel together. And then we'll drop him off. It's quicker for him to do that coming from Dallas, because there's a direct, basically he takes Highway 22 out to what will be by that point Highway 18. So and so we'll just collect in there.
And then Kathy's gonna get us at the beach.
Pardon me?
Kathy's gonna get us at the coast.
Yeah, she'll meet us at the coast. So
Oh, she did say if anyone wanted to come down Friday night.
Friday night.
I can't, but. If you guys wanted to. It would be fun. It's not much. Yeah, I have so much pieces I have to do. I have to take out this key. Yes.
any questions before we get cracking?
How are you doing? Yeah.
I'm doing okay. I learned that my house was gonna get listed for a lot more than I thought. So that's, at least, that's the initial, that's the initial target, so. And if it sells for that, I'll have a big grin on my face because. I'll have a lot more money.
There you go.
So, anyway. Fingers doing better, I took the Band-Aid off of it today, so, this is nothing.
That's bad.
Oh, no, you haven't seen what it looked like. This is actually a substantial improvement over what it was.
We can figure out what it is. Do you know what the bacteria specifically is?
No, I don't.
We have the skills now.
Yeah. Well, I've whacked it with antibiotics so that it may or may not still be there. We're mostly in healing mode right now. But, the finger's starting to actually feel a little bit normal. except when I bang it on
Yeah.
something, and then it just really hurts. And I have a really high pain tolerance, but that just really hurts, so. Anyway. Anything else? Shall we learn some more about my, yes,
So with this, our conservation reports are on the 2nd of April. That's a separate presentation.
I just set them for when we came back from spring break.
Okay, so the,
That Tuesday or Thursday?
It's gonna take us to, well, one period plus one presentation, because I can't get all four of you in on one lecture, so we'll go one lecture plus a little. So, to be honest, ideally, I'd like to do it on Tuesday, start Tuesday and just finish it up on Thursday, and just get it out of the way.
You know, I'm on order it.
When would you like to have the orders? In other words, you want to know which one of you doesn't have to do the prep over spring break? I'll get that set. I'll get that set before next Tuesday. How about that?
could I do on like, the next one, should I do like one of the first ones? I feel like I'll progress and.
Sure.
Okay.
Huh?
If you wanna go on Thursday, I'll go.
So in other words, who's got a coin?
Oh, I didn't do it?
We'll do this scientifically.
Oh, I have one. Yes, okay, I have it.
All right, tails? All right, flip it.
Okay.
If I win, am I going on Thursday or am I going on Tuesday?
You can have the choice
Okay.
if you win.
Wait, the whole point is that you don't.
I don't care.
Yeah,
Okay,
flip
okay.
it.
Okay, heads is Whitney goes on Tuesday, tails is I go Tuesday.
All
Is
right.
that okay? Wait, that's the same thing.
Wait, Ed, when you go on Tuesday.
Yeah, like, never go.
What is it? It's
Okay.
head.
So you go Thursday, I'll go Tuesday.
Okay, all right, there you go. So the order has been decided already.
Yeah.
Just get with the program.
I mean, you said you'd do it by next Tuesday and you did, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything else? Are there any other tattoos we need to see before we start? Oh, you missed that already.
No, I did, I found the box elder beetle.
Oh.
I found the box elder beetle and then I showed it to my friend and then he was like, Emily has box elder tattoo. I was like, what?
Yeah, show mine.
Yeah, yeah, please. I actually want to make it to retirement and emeritus state. So, yeah. All right. We are slowly plunging into silliness here.
Slowly.
Yeah, I was being kind.
We're really good at that though. We should have a good time in this class.
We do have a good time. Yes.
How do you measure, this is completely off topic, but how do you measure the metabolism of aquatic friends?
Of aquatic what?
Like friends, like if I
Um,
wanted to measure.
You
aquatic
throw them in the
agents,
water and see if they're breathing heavy or not.
But like, how do you measure do they make systems that can measure water? Cause I feel like if I hooked up water things to the FMS, that wouldn't go well.
We're on this.
Yeah, that would jeopardize your graduation.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe even my living to graduation.
So they actually make oxygen sensors for water.
Okay,
And so if you're trying to measure metabolism of a fish, which I assume falls into the category of water friends,
yeah,
then there would be an oxygen probe that would be in the water and you would measure the change in oxygen in water. The big thing that you have to be careful with is something like that though, is it needs to be a sealed system. Because if it's not, then you'll get diffusion of oxygen from the atmosphere back into the water. And so you want it to be a sealed system. So that doesn't happen. Was there a reason for asking that question, or was it something, was it another issue of a dream?
Well, see, I was looking over there and I was like, wow, what if there were little friends in there? Like little, like plant friends?
Are there in both friends?
Oh, there are bug friends in there? Anyway, I was like, wow, what if, like, how would I know what their metabolism is? And then I was like, oh, what about leeches? I wonder what leeches metabolisms are like. And I said, how can I measure that? I don't know.
I just told you, with an
Yep.
oxygen probe, stick it into a container, put the container in the conditions you want, and let it go.
Nice. Okay.
We actually have an oxygen probe around somewhere. Although if I were going to do something like that for research, we would get a much better one than what we have. So. All righty. Can I start? All right, I am making no promises about how fluid this is going to be today, so. Fluid being, you know what? It just is. There you go. All right. So last time when we had just started talking about migration, I referenced this table that I am going to show you now. And this actually comes from your text, or at least the content of it comes from your text. I don't remember if the text actually has this table in it or not, but it contrasts the three annual cycle strategies, at least in the broadest context, because these three different strategies right here, just like a lot of things that we humans like to compartmentalize, probably are a little simplistic to throw every bird into one of these three boxes. So for example, we talk about migrants. Migrants, you have long distance migrants, short distance migrants, and elevational migrants, and so there is probably a little more of a gradient between all of this than what these boxes imply. But the boxes serve to actually teach us some very important things that you all are going to really appreciate knowing, right? All right. So we'll start here with the tropical resident. Tropical resident is going to be a bird that spends its entire life in some tropical environment, okay? Probably something that maybe you all want to do is to go be on a tropical beach for the rest of your life. I don't know. There are trade-offs for birds being in any one of these three scenarios. So for a tropical resident, the big benefit that they get is they have really high adult annual survival. So we have both components of fitness here: survivorship and reproductive success. Survivorship is really high in tropical residents, largely because they don't face any serious climatic issues. The biggest thing that they have to deal with is predation, right? But they live in environments that are pretty highly vegetated, so even escaping predation is something that they can do successfully. Where they get hit is in reproductive success, because contrary to what you might think about a tropical environment, food resources are actually fairly scattered in tropical environments, and so they have to actually put a bit of effort into finding food. The one exception to this might be insectivores, but even in insectivores, it's not like you've got these big, massive, explosive bursts of insect reproduction that occur at a given time, like you would find during the warmer months in a temperate climate. So what this results in is a relatively low reproductive rate. In fact, if you look at the clutch sizes of tropical birds, they tend to be relatively low compared to birds that exist in temperate climates. Okay, so but they have good longevity, so they have potentially more reproductive seasons in order to produce offspring. Okay, then we move over to the migrants. Now, the migrants don't have to deal with harsh winters anywhere because they pick up and leave. Their problem is they still suffer somewhat high mortality, annual mortality, because the cost of migrating is just really high. And so there is a lot of potential things that could knock a bird off during migration. And so the mortality is lower than what you would find, or than what you find in a temperate environment, but it's substantially higher than what you would find for tropical residents. And so roughly half the birds that migrate are not going to make it. So that's still not great adult survivorship. But reproduction is much better than tropical residents because they're going to end up in a temperate climate someplace where food resources are abundant. But because they've had to invest so much energy in the act of migrating, that is less energy for them to invest in reproduction. So that does limit how much reproduction they can engage in their on the reproductive side of migration. So they're kind of in the middle in that regard. Then we get temperate residents over here. Temperate residents take the biggest survivorship hit because, you know, particularly if they're living in places that have really cold winter, there's just no food availability. So you have a lot of adult mortality. So survivorship is really low, can be as low as like 20%. Okay, and where it falls on this range here between 20 and 50% probably depends on where, you know, which temperate environment you live in. Because, you know, if you live in Oregon or, you know, Willamette Valley, it's cold, there's not a lot of food, but it doesn't freeze that often here, except for this year. Okay, so mortality is the highest for a temperate resident, but reproduction is also the highest because during the summer you get these massive insect blooms that these temperate residents can take advantage of, and where they gain a foothold over the migrants is that they're there first. You know, they're not having to travel to their breeding areas. So they can be there from the very start. So they have a nice size window in which they can reproduce. They can have multiple clutches, perhaps. So they have really high reproductive success, but they have the lowest adult survivorship. So you can see all three of these annual cycle strategies right here come with trade-offs. Yeah.
Do we know, like, and this might just be too general, but like the general fitness for each of these? I mean, they all exist. So
Define general fitness.
like, so survival and reproductive success, like say a tropical resident might live for 5 years, but they only have like 2 eggs a year or whatever. And so like theirs would be 10. Yeah, 5 times 2 is 10. Like 10.
Yeah, but the other thing you got to think about is, remember when we were talking about reproduction in the tropic, they also have a longer breeding season.
Right.
So that also means that they could multiple clutch.
Yeah.
So if their clutch size was 2, and let's say that they clutch 3 times, then the overall reproductive success for that single year would be 6 eggs,
Yeah.
assuming those all survive.
Yeah.
Which is not likely to be the case.
Yeah.
So yeah. So, you know, what do you guys think would be the best? I mean, birds fall into all 3 of these categories. Why would, you know, why, if one isn't the best, if there was one of these that was the best, would you not expect all birds to do it? There are some birds, I mean, if you're a penguin, it would be pretty hard to, you know, probably migrate very far. Yeah.
This kind of reminds me of like R and K selection.
You know what? That's it. I keep telling Aaron that you keep bringing up ecology in here. R and K selection is actually another one of those things that humans like to categorize because they are actually extremes. There is a whole gradient between between R and K. I mean, what is very classical K selection is those big insect bursts that drive this high reproductive rate of temperate residence, because you got these insects that are having this massive reproduction, and then they go out and eat all of these things. Birds are kind of interesting on that scale because for birds, the most common cause of mortality is predation. So most adults don't live a maximal lifespan, and so it's very rare that you find bird there are a lot of exceptions to this, but there are a lot of bird populations that never get limited by resources, so would not exhibit what I would consider to be classic K selection. And a lot of times when you're looking at when you are looking at that sort of thing. No, I just lost track where I was going to go with all of that. But anyway, birds are a little bit odd in that regard because of the fact that predation just drives their population size as much as resource availability does.
Interesting. Yeah, I had, yeah.
Yeah. So when you look there's this population growth model that's called the logistic equation. Okay. And it is kind of a modification of exponential growth. Okay. And so what it does is it puts a cap on exponential growth. So you have exponential growth is kind of n times r, and r is the reproductive rate of a population. And if it goes unchecked, it just, as populations increase, the numbers increase exponentially. But in K-selected species, the population size is limited by the amount of resources that are available. So there's a limitation on how many individuals that a population can support. All right. So what happens is you get you have added to the exponential growth equation. You have it's K minus N over K. And what that does is as the population size approaches K, then that term approaches zero. And when it hits zero, growth rate becomes zero at that point. Okay. And then so that your population flattens out, so that, notice how I remembered that? That's it's impressive, huh?
Super impressed.
Yeah. Anyway, so it'll flatten out and into a horizontal line. You'll get no further increase in population size because K basically is the carrying capacity of the environment. That is the number of individuals that the resources in that environment will support. Okay. Now, the logistic model is a very simplistic model, and there are very few populations that actually strictly follow that. But that's where the terms R and K selection come from.
Pass the test.
Cool. Good. You can go back and tell Aaron that I adequately explained R and K selection in the class.
love that I didn't understand these concepts for both classes.
Yeah.
It's a little
All right. So I mentioned earlier that migrations can be of highly variable lengths. Here's one of the champions, okay, the Arctic tern. The round trip on their migration is roughly 25,000 kilometers. Try to walk that. And these arrows here roughly outline the migratory path of these birds. So you can tell that they are in the air a lot over the course of their annual cycle. And this is actually from your text, I think. And this is a satellite tracking of a couple of Arctic terns on their journey. So you can just see how spaghetti-ish this is, and there may be more than one on each of these maps too. I'm not exactly sure. But and the color gives you the time of year that they're tracking it, so you can kind of know where they're at. It's quite an extensive migration. And when you think about terns, they have high-speed wings. And so actually being in the air a lot is, traveling at a good clip is a good thing for them. Yeah.
Looking at like the color coding for different times, it seems like the winter range, December to March, and then return migration, April to May, are pretty similar in both graphs, but the post-breeding migration in green, they go to completely different continents. Is there a reason that part of the migration would be more variable than other parts?
Well, the migratory path for a northward versus a southward migration are often very different. In fact, I'm going to show you in just a moment another example of that. Okay, and a lot of that has to do with what they encounter when they are migrating in one direction versus the other. Conditions and winds and things like that. So there are a lot of reasons, and it could be food availability, in one place versus the other.
What's the difference between the left and right?
I think they're just a different set of birds.
Oh, okay.
Also, for those of us who are not as metrically inclined, that's like 43 miles a day.
Yeah.
That's a long ways.
Yeah, it is.
I was like, that doesn't seem like that much. But it is.
Yeah, go walk it.
Nope. Fairly wrong one.
Yeah, I mean, it would take you, what, an hour to drive that in a car?
Yeah.
If you didn't have traffic?
Yeah.
So, that is cooking it. But a lot of these birds can fly, between 20 and 30 miles an hour. So.
Yeah.
All right. So here's another interesting migration, the blackpoll warbler, which I have seen up in Canada. Historically, it has been thought that the way they migrated, when they were going to migrate south, they would all go to the East Coast over here, go out to sea, and then drop straight down to South America. A very impressive flight for this bird that's probably about 15 grams. Okay, all right. So it was believed that the flight took 86 consecutive hours of flight. So I would challenge you to flap your arms for 86 consecutive hours. Yeah.
Maybe you're gonna stay awake for 86.
Well, and if you think about it again, and the warbler's a passerine, so it's got elliptical wings and it has to flap a lot.
Yeah.
In order to fly.
I can't even stay awake for 12 sometimes.
So in 1989, a fellow by the name of Murray published a paper where he actually argued that this was a misrepresentation of what the warblers actually did. And what he said is that the bulk of the warblers actually make their way down the coast and really don't leap off until we get down to the southeastern portion of the US. But even so, regardless of which way it worked, it's still a pretty impressive migratory feat. Yeah.
Why did he challenge it? Like what data did he have?
You know what? I think it was more a case of he decided to look at this because at some level he probably didn't believe that these warblers could actually do it. But in spite of what Murray suggested, looking at some radar tracking, and I'll actually show you a radar image in a little bit of how radar is used to track migrants, as well as some other methods. I think they pretty much verified that a lot of these birds do go out to sea and fly straight down to South America. And what the suspicion is as to how they're able to deal with this is because when they get out to sea, a lot of birds can catch trade winds, which will literally blow them south, which will save them a whole bunch in terms of flight costs. And, it's just like if you get, when I fly to New York, it takes me 4.5 hours to fly east. It takes me 6 hours to fly west. Okay. And that has everything to do with what way the winds are blowing. And so the birds, I'm sure, take advantage of this as well. And then what's also interesting is northern spring migrations. It tends to, for at least these species, tend to be what they call a little bit more leisurely. Although that's going to contradict something that I'm going to say a little bit later. So you have to kind of think about this a little bit. Anywho. And so what we mean by that is you look at the pathway that the black holes take going north, it's very land bound. But the thing that I'm going to say a little bit later is, when a bird's heading toward its breeding ground, that generally tends to be a quicker migration than heading south. And it's totally possible that being leisurely doesn't mean being slow. I don't know. So. And because particularly if you're a territorial species, if you are the last person to get to the breeding ground, then you're the last person to get last bird to get your choice of territories. And warblers in general are not territorial, so at least not that I'm aware of. Okay, so a lot of times migratory routes will cross over some pretty big barriers. And this can be large bodies of water, like the Atlantic Ocean, or big deserts that really don't offer much of a respite for birds that are passing over it. And so what will happen a lot of times, if these barriers are in the middle of a major migratory route, and a classic one is going to be the Gulf of Mexico, then what will happen is these birds will be so exhausted by the time they cross this barrier that they will be grounded in huge numbers. And we call this fallout. And so this is a real common thing with neotropical migrants coming up from South America. And so if you really want to get your bird list up really fast, go to the right times of year, and take your lawn chair and your lemonade and just sit right on the coast of Louisiana or Texas, where there is that tree. And it is not unusual to see a whole bunch of species of birds in one tree that are all taking a breather after flying over the Gulf. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people will travel to the southern coast just to experience fallout. So really easy to see a lot of species of birds. Now, when we think of migration, we think of a bird from one place, or a species of bird that migrates. They're in one place during the winter, then they get up and they move a distance to someplace better for summer and reproductive. But that's not the way migration works with all species of birds. Migration can actually be facultative, and what we mean by that is the migration is somewhat flexible. It may happen in some years and may not happen in other years, depending on things like food availability. Okay, and so species that may exhibit some facultative migration will exhibit some what we would call eruptive movements, and snowy owls is a classic example of that. And I'll actually show you a plot of this in the next slide, where birds will move to an area that they don't normally inhabit because the area where they normally inhabit has low food availability. Yes, Emma.
Would facultative migrators, I guess you could call them, exhibit Zugenru? That's the word, right?
That's actually a good question, and I do not know the answer to that.
Okay.
I really don't. You know, I tend to think of facultative migrators as not traveling very far. So it's conceivable that they wouldn't to the same degree, because I think Zugenru is something that is genetic. And if a species is not prone to migrate all the time, then they may not, then there may be other factors that drive them to move. Because a facultative migrator is probably not moving by choice.
Okay.
Okay, another type of migratory behavior that we see is what we call partial migration. And this occurs when you've got a single species of bird where you will have some populations that are migratory and some that are not, or some individuals that are migratory and some that are not. And you can even, there are some populations where you will have migratory individuals and non-migratory individuals. And there are two basic types. First is obligate partial migration. And this is what occurs when some members of the population are literally genetically inclined to migrate, and then others are not. And the European robin, this guy right here, is an example of that. Okay, and I'll actually show you some data from another species that does this as well. Yeah.
Why would? Is that like males migrated, females don't, or like based on age, like why?
No, because if it's genetic, then you can't just have one gender that has the gene. I mean, it's going to have to be built in the population.
So it's like random.
No, I'm sure it's not random. And if you think about how selection works, you could have a situation where let's just say there was just real food restriction in an area where these birds existed, so that every year some individuals had to engage in perhaps some sort of an eruptive movement. Okay, and maybe over a period of years, individuals were selected for this migratory behavior, and so you kind of built this migratory population of that species. That makes sense? So that could be what's driving something like that. Yeah.
So with facultative migrators, do they eventually return back to like the spot?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not like they just leave.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Another way that that partial migration could develop would be if you have a totally migratory species, and then you experience a milding climate. So that because whenever you're looking at anything that's genetic, there's a range of what the phenotype looked like. You may have an extreme phenotype that actually did okay without migrating, and so didn't have the same inclination. And that could have developed into a non-migratory population, because they would likely be breeding with each other, because particularly if they're in the breeding area, because they would be there first. And so you would get that separation, because all the migratory individuals would come back and they would likely start breeding with each other as well. All right. So that's obligate partial migration. Then there is facultative partial migration, which could be a precursor to obligate partial migration. So facultative partial migration occurs when you get a portion of the population that must migrate because for whatever reason, their habitat just won't support all the individuals that have been produced. We had this, had an example of this occur several years ago, when the Willamette Valley was just inundated with mountain chickadees. It's only happened once. But they were all over the Willamette Valley. And, a lot of people getting their first county records of mountain chickadees, because Clearly, I mean, we'll see those when we go up the mountain. But what I'm guessing is that there must have been something that happened up there that really made it difficult for all these mountain chickadees to stay up there, and they all just came down the mountain and hung out in the valley that year, and I've never seen it happen again. All right, so here is our spotted owl. The solid color areas here are where the owl normally inhabits. But when the food availability, up north up here is not really good, this dotted line represents an eruptive movement that the snowy owl will occur with the snowy owl, and we will get them farther south, even here in Oregon. And if it's like it's a really low food year, we can get a lot of them down here. So, all right. So tracking migration is actually a bit of a challenge, particularly for small birds. And their migratory behavior is studied in a number of different ways. So we ban birds. Okay, so what we can do is we can put an identifying band on a bird, and then we have a whole bunch of stations that are set up, north to south, that will trap birds. And by grabbing birds that have been banded, you can gain some sort of a sense as to the direction that they have been traveling, where they have been. Okay, so that is one way, and you can see bands right here. And like I say, trapping is done in a variety of locations. Another more modern technique that is sort of like banding is to label the birds with pit tags, RFID tags. And this is nice because you don't have to actually catch the bird to identify it. So here is a picture of a hummingbird. This is a ruby-throated hummingbird that actually has a pit tag. And this is an antenna right here, just going and sticking its head through the antenna to feed. And the antenna is connected to a device that will register the pit tag number. And that pit tag number can be referenced to a specific individual bird. And so that's being used more and more commonly in the field. And I think at some point when the technology advances such that we can safely put these things into smaller birds, that it will eventually replace banding as well, it's because you don't have to catch them. You can just set up antennas at a site and it'll record. I mean, the only thing that you lose is you don't get to take morphometrics, but if you can take morphometrics the first time you catch the bird, things like bill size and wing length should not change, and the only things that will be variable from, between times you catch them would be things like, fat content. But just in terms of getting longevity information on birds, and knowing, where they are, this is a very non-invasive, over the long term, non-invasive way to do it. But right now, quite frankly, putting a pit tag in a 3-gram ruby-throated hummingbird is a challenge. And this picture is from Ken Welch, and he's done this, but I know for a fact that he had some bird mortality putting these pit tags in these birds. But once they get them, I mean, it's a marker in these birds for the rest of their life. Just like chipping a dog. Radar has been a way that you can track movements of large groups of birds. And this is actually a radar tracking right here of birds moving from Cuba to Florida. And so you can see that. And the thing radar has been really helpful with is it's been an important tool in helping us to understand the reduction, in the numbers of migratory birds over the last 50 years. Yeah.
How exactly does it work? Like, how does it know that each of those things are birds?
Well, you can't necessarily, unless you have some idea, you can get the size of the area where the birds are flying through. if you have some decent estimate of what the density of birds are, then you could actually approximate a number of birds that are in that group. But you would never know for certain. You wouldn't know what the species composition is or anything like that. But if the birds are traveling in mass, then radar can pick that up. Yeah.
What is on the little perch, or like, is there something connected to the hummingbird's foot, or what's going on?
Well, save that question for, I think it's the next slide.
Okay, perfect.
It is the next slide. So, just to show you the value of pit tags and ways that you can actually garner data that you normally would have to catch a bird to get. So this is a cartoon diagram of Ken's setup right here. So this is a pit tag bird sticking its head through the antenna to feed, and then the perch is attached to a scale. So when the bird lands, he can get a mass off the bird. And again, without catching it. And he actually generated this data set of birds prepping for migration. So you can see days before migration. So he started a couple of weeks before migration, and then you can see that when you get down to less than a week before migration, they start to exponentially increase in mass to put on that fat so that their migration will be fueled. And then on the day they migrate, and that's it. And so that's what he was doing with this study, was really trying to understand natural mass gain prior to migration. These, Whitney, are smaller than the ones that we use because all they do is provide an ID. They don't provide temperature. So these are 7 millimeters. Ours are what, 11 or 13? Yeah, almost twice as big. Which is why he could get these in to ruby throats.
But he's like sticking on up inside, right?
No, he's putting in subcutaneous.
But it's like underneath the skin.
It's underneath the skin.
Okay.
Yeah,
What part of the body?
I'm guessing it's along the big flight muscles. That would be the easiest place to do that, I think. And I'm sure he has to anesthetize the bird to make that happen. But having said that, Lisa Tell, a research veterinarian at UC Davis, she's given up banding altogether. This is the only way she tracks Anna's hummingbirds now. And so she does this routinely with Anna's hummingbirds. And she doesn't, we would normally, for something bigger, like a dog, we would use a syringe to basically inject the RFID tag. She actually will make an incision, a small incision in the skin, and then slip it through the hole. And she's a veterinarian, so she can do that. And then I think she actually sutures it up. So.
I missed it. Is the bird standing on a scale?
Yes.
Okay.
You just can't see the scale. This is just a perch that's attached to the pan of the scale there.
Got you.
And I've actually done a study where I've set up balances that way. Mimi, formerly Camacho, now Sandoval, what's her last name? She did a study on daytime mass change in hummingbirds up in Arizona, where we put a whole bunch of these, where we put 4 of these scales at feeders out in the feeder patch. Nowadays, if your bird's big enough, you can actually, and even Arctic terns are big enough for this, you can actually track using satellite, because that's how they got all those tracings for the Arctic tern migration, is they tracked it with a satellite. And this here is the movements of a single young osprey clear up here from Martha's Vineyard up here in the Northeast, and watching its movements all the way down to South America. And they could do all this tracking from somebody's office desk. But the downside of this, it's very expensive. So, departure dates and arrival dates and migration are things that are precisely timed by birds. Birds are really good at knowing exactly when they got to get up and go, and knowing when they've got to get there. And frankly, I'm just going to put the rest of the bullet points here because these are all reviewed for you because we covered all of this in the last topic. You know, there's a big genetic component to migration. You know, we talked about Zuganru and the birds getting restless, and then how you know, changes in the photoperiod will promote hyperphagia and fat deposition, like we just saw in the ruth-throated hummingbird. We talked about how hormonal changes drive a lot of this stuff, and so we talked about adrenocortical hormones and prolactin, largely from that study of white-crowned sparrows. And with the big point that I wanted to make on this slide is that migration is controlled both by what's going on in the environment as well as physiological cycles. Here's a really nice graph. I like this graph a lot. This came out of the 3rd edition of your text. And so you probably have this in the 4th edition, but it's probably colorful because they colored all of their pictures, which actually I think don't, in some cases, I still use the 3rd edition versions of them because I actually like them better. They have better contrast. But anyway, here's a resident bird, and you can see what's going on with body mass right here. You see a little bump in body mass during molt, and this is likely energy acquisition to support molt. And then the body mass is just kind of, you know, steady eddy throughout the rest of the year. Here is a migrant. We get that same little bump in body mass that corresponds with molt. We get Zuganru, and then we get this huge increase in body mass just prior to migration occurring. And so how mass is managed in a migrant versus a resident is substantially different over the course of the annual cycle. One of my favorite examples of precise timing, in fact, a big chunk of an economy is based on this, are the swallows at San Juan Capistrano in California. Anybody ever heard of this? The big swallow festival? Goodness gracious. So San Juan Capistrano, which is a relatively coastal town in Southern California, is they actually count on the swallows returning the week of March 19th. These are cliff swallows. They build a whole festival around this. People come in droves to celebrate the arrival of the swallows, you know. And San Juan Capistrano is one of Capistrano's missions. Anyway, so it's really it's kind of a fun event, but it's just an illustration of just how precisely timed arrival is for these birds. Now that they don't have an exact day, because again, you can get fine tuning of those arrival times depending on what the prevailing conditions are at any place in the migration. Okay, so the next question that I know was burning on everybody's brain is how high do birds fly when they migrate? You've really been thinking about that this entire lecture. So now I'm gonna,
Yeah.
yeah. So now I'm gonna clue you in on this. All right. A lot of times, how high a bird flies when they're migrating is going to be dictated by wind. So just like the blackpoll that may catch a trade wind to fly south, which they wouldn't be able to get going north, which is probably why they tend to have a more landlocked migration when they're going north. You know, you can get up to different altitudes, and you even see this with planes. When you're flying on jet and you've got bumpy air someplace, You know, the pilot will request permission to change altitude in order to see if they can find smoother air. Okay, and birds probably do some very, very similar things. The problem with flying higher is that you've got to deal with colder temperatures, which is going to ramp up your metabolism. And you're dealing with lower oxygen levels because the air gets thinner when you get up to higher altitudes. And now the metabolism thing, it's always hard to know how much of a cost that really is, because for everybody who has worked in my lab, you know that birds produce extra heat when they fly. And so it's conceivable that the extra cost of going to a colder temperature may be somewhat compensated for or substituted for by the extra heat that's produced during flight. So there may not be as big of a metabolic cost of flying in a colder temperature as there would be if the bird was just perched. So the majority of songbirds, passerines, will migrate below 2,000 feet, i.e. 610 meters. So they don't fly very high. This is going to be a common theme with passerines because, again, you know, they have those elliptical wings. And so you can imagine that flying in lower air density would be extremely hard for them. And so they probably would not be anywhere near as effective flyers if they were up at a very high altitude. They also tend to be pretty small. So the extra cold may also impact them. 90% of all migratory birds, regardless of taxon, will fly below 6,500 feet, roughly 2,000 meters. There are some exceptions to this, however. Birds will tend to fly higher when making crossings over water. And one reason for this may be that you get smoother air up a little higher, which makes flying a little bit easier. Okay, some shorebirds will fly as high as 15,000 feet. So, you know, half the height of a jet airliner, which is a little more than 4,500 meters. Now for shorebirds, which actually tend to fly long distance, you know, their migration intervals tend to be fairly long. Remember, they have high-speed wings. So, I mean, for them, they're moving and they're moving fast because that's how they can efficiently produce lift. And so being at a higher altitude is probably less of an issue for them because they produce lift so efficiently that they can probably deal with the lower air densities better than a passerine. Daytime migrants generally travel at low altitudes. Probably a reason for this is that when we get to the last section on migration, one of the first things we'll talk about when we talk about navigation tools is landmarks. And so if you're navigating during the daytime, you know, you may be looking for landmarks, and it's hard to do that when you're really high up in the sky. If you're following a river or something like that, it's not quite so difficult. But you know, if you need something a little more granular than that, you need to be lower to do it. Of course, and I think this makes common sense, really high altitude migration will occur over large mountain ranges. But there are not a lot of birds that will do that. A lot of birds, and then we talked about how the direction of migration in the old world is a little more scrambled than it is here in our country because of the mountain ranges aren't all oriented in one direction. And some of this scrambleness could be due to the fact that they're going around the mountains rather than going over them. But this guy right here is the champion with regard to elevation, because the bar-headed goose routinely migrates at almost 28,000 feet. In other words, you could be sitting in that Southwest flight, look out the window, and have a bar-headed goose smiling at you. Okay. So that is 8,500 meters. How in the world can a bar-headed goose do this? I mean, we couldn't exist. And it has nothing to do with temperature, although we would freeze. We couldn't breathe at that altitude. You know, but they can. So, what kind of adaptations does a bar-headed goose have to make such a feat possible? They have a little bit bigger wingspan and lower wing loading than geese of their relative size. So their wings are designed for a little bit better lift production. Their flight muscles are much better oxygenated than what you would find in other waterfowl. Okay, so it may be fiber types that they have. They certainly have more circulation, most likely. So they can supply their cells with oxygen quickly. They tend to have somewhat larger lungs, which probably helps them to extract oxygen better in a low oxygen environment. This is one I find interesting. They have this capacity to hyperventilate really fast, but they don't suffer any ill effects of it. One of the big problems of hyperventilation is you blow off CO2 so fast that it causes you to experience alkalosis, because your blood loses acidity when you lose CO2, and these bar-headed geese don't seem to have a problem with that. And hyperventilation works better in a bird than it does in a mammal because you've got that unidirectional flow of air. Yeah, go ahead.
Because if they suffer no ill effects, is that their blood pH isn't changing, or it is changing and they're just okay with that?
I think that it's not changing. And don't ask me how they pull that off, but that's my impression, is that it's not changing. I think it would be difficult for them to remain physiologically sound if the blood pH did change, because then, I mean, if they were tolerating the change, they would have to have proteins whose foldings did not change over a wide range of pHs. And I think that would be more challenging than having a proficient way of regulating your pH in this scenario. But take that as speculation. Okay. They can increase their cardiac output in hypoxia. So, and that's what being up at 28,000 feet would be. That's total hypoxia. Okay. To 5 times what they are capable of at rest. That is a lot. And then finally, their hemoglobin is really adapted to load oxygen. And so what we mean by this is hemoglobin, it always walks a balance between what level of affinity it has for oxygen. And so, you know, when hemoglobin is in the lungs, you want it to have a high affinity for oxygen because you really want it to load up. But when it gets out to the tissue, you want it to dump all that oxygen because you want the cells to have it. And so the way that that's handled physiologically is you get slight alterations in the pH, which change how hard the hemoglobin hangs on to the oxygen. And so what this is saying here is that their hemoglobin is adapted to grab onto that oxygen really, really tightly. But not so tightly that it can't let it go to its flight muscles to maintain flight. That's the short explanation without going into an entire explanation of an oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, so how fast do birds fly? I know that's a second most burning question on your brains. During migrations, birds are considered to fly relatively fly at relatively slow speeds. Okay, then they say 20 to 30 miles per hour, 32 to 48 kilometers per hour. Go out and try to run that fast. But for a bird, that's going to, that's probably going to be right at that that maximum distance point on their power curve. Waterfowl and shorebirds fly faster than a passerine would. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess for sure it makes sense to get high speed wings, but how like a waterfowl? But faster.
Because a lot of waterfowl have high-speed wings. Remember, all the diving ducks have high-speed wings.
Oh, no.
And I'm guessing that that's mostly what's being referred to here. And so flying at a higher speed gives them better lift production than flying at slower speeds does. They would have to flat more at slower speeds. Songbirds and spring migration. So here's the contradiction from what I told you earlier. Songbirds and spring migration move more slow or more rapidly than in fall migration. And this is due to shorter stopovers and longer flights. So this may or may not be a contradiction. So when we talked about that northward migration being more leisurely, it may be termed more leisurely because they're making more stops, but the stops may be shorter than any stop they would make coming south, which perhaps would make the migration shorter. The idea for a short spring migration is you really want to get to the breeding ground as quickly as you can. Okay. And so that's the real selective pressure for a faster spring migration. Passerines in general migrate over relatively short flights, and so they may go about 200 miles a day if they don't have to cross a barrier. And again, this makes sense because again, this is their trade-off for having elliptical wings. They probably exert a lot of energy to fly, and so they have to refuel more frequently than a bird that would have high-speed wings would have. But when they get to their breeding grounds, those elliptical wings serve them well to go forage. So, and then waterfowl and shorebirds, again, we're talking about birds that have high-speed wings, take much longer flights, sometimes a whole order of magnitude longer. And they can make that flight in just a couple of days. All right, questions? Because we're going to switch to navigation tools now.
Are there like particular flyways that have like a higher mortality rate in general? Like, for example, birds crossing through Central United States, something like the carriage.
My guess is, so that's actually a very good question. You're the first person in 34 years that's ever asked that. So pat yourself on the back. And I honestly don't have a for certain answer for that. If I had to make a guess, I would guess that birds flying over the Gulf would have a higher mortality than birds that are coming straight up, through Central America, Mexico, into North America. That would be a total guess, but that would be my suspicion. Anything else? All right. Let me tell you, it puzzled biologists for a long time as to how the heck a bird that was going all the way down to South America could come all the way back to North America and nest in exactly the same tree, and in some cases, exactly the same branch. If I were to take you guys and dump you in the middle of the Amazon and say, see you back in Newburgh, I probably would never see you again. You'd have trouble just figuring out which way was north. You know, but birds just are really, really good at this. So study of bird navigation was really, really intense for a long period of time, although we've got a pretty decent handle on it now. These navigational abilities that they use, you have a question?
Go ahead, Mitch.
Oh, okay. These navigational tools that they use can give them some very precise information about where they're going, where they are. And I'm going to show you some really clever experiments that people have done to kind of work out some of this stuff. I don't know if I'll get to them today, but on Tuesday, when we finish this up, we'll get to see some of these things. And as I said, birds can return to a specific tree after wintering in South America. One of the first people to study this, and one of the first people to actually kind of band a bird, was John James Audubon. Because what he did is he tied a little bit of silk around an eastern phoebe. And that tree came back to his yard the very next year. And he knew it was that bird because it still had the silk on its leg. Simple, but effective.
What if it was like somebody in South America, it's stuck around the eastern Indian city, you know?
Do what?
Somebody in South America tied stuck around.
Yeah, trying to really screw up Audubon.
Yeah.
All right. Other experiments, and I'll show you an example of this. I think it's in the next slide. Shearwaters and sparrows have been transported by plane to totally unfamiliar places and let go, and they always find their way. Okay, so since we don't hear enough about white-crowned sparrows in this class, we're going to talk about white-crowned sparrows. So some white-crowned sparrows were captured in San Jose, California, and then they were flown to two different locations, to Laurel, Maryland, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and let go. Okay, back in the day when you could do those sorts of things. And what happened is these sparrows, presumably, I say it's presumably, well, actually, I guess they did. I guess they knew they did this. They went to their breeding grounds up here where the green is, and then, returned to San Jose the very next year.
They're like, screw you, I'm going back.
But think about that.
Yeah.
If I dropped you off in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and said walk home, you might actually make it home better from there than you would the Amazon. But even so, it wouldn't be a straight line.
Yeah, yeah.
You can rely on like road science and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that is impressive.
Yeah.
So birds have a number of different tools, and we probably won't get done through more than this today. But when we come back on Tuesday, we're going to talk about solar compasses, some really cool experiments that were done to demonstrate the use of the solar compass. And also, I will show you an experiment that suggests that birds don't always do it what you might perceive to be the easy way. But anyway, so birds will rely on visual landmarks, both to kind of hone in locally where they're at, as well as for long distance migration. So things like coastlines and rivers are used by a lot of birds. You know, birds of prey and waterfowl use these a lot. And what's really interesting is birds will follow things like this or coast, but they actually don't like to fly over water, even though some of them do. Okay, So when birds are migrating along a restricted travel route, and the example we're using here is Cape May, New Jersey, because remember, they don't like to fly over water, and so they are flying down the east coast here, tracking the coast, and then they get funneled out onto this point right here. And so this is another one of these places where migratory birds are highly concentrated. So it's a very hot birding spot because this is the shortest distance between the 2 points of land on this route right here. And so they all funnel to this point. And so, you know, it's someplace I need to go one of these days. All right, we'll stop there.
You'll be so much closer.
Yeah.
I will be.
I'm so sad because I used to go there every summer, just like to be on the coast or on the shore. And then I just heard everyone being like, Cape May, Cape May, Cape May. And I'm like, hey, what? There are birds there? I really missed out.
You did.
Could go birding with.
I mean, it would be a nice spring break trip for you.
Yeah,
Just saying.
yeah.